Greetings and welcome back to room 303. We turn now in freshman English to the classic Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. I'm with you in your hymnals on page 58, 59 and following. Now, this is of course a really famous text in short story literature, in American literature. Of course, if you know anything at all about Edgar Allan Poe, he is that classic horror, macabre sometimes is the word that gets used with this guy's stuff. And so we're going to take a look now at a text. I've had freshmen who argue, once they've studied this text with me, this is not a story that should be taught to freshmen. It's a little too dangerous of a story. And I think we'll try and maybe figure out why there are some arguments that could be made for this kind of thing. Let's turn to page 58 quickly. Take a look there as your question that you're looking at, the vocabulary words as well there at the bottom of page 58. And then the information on page 59. Take a look at it with me. By the way, at 2b, we will follow the same information from the story that we just worked with, the Aiken story, okay, Harp and Bicycle, Sonata for Harp and Bicycle. And we will work with plot here, so write that one down. And more particularly, jot down at 2b, this will be the question that I will be asking of you. What is the conflict of this story? Okay? What is for you the conflict of this story? All right? Now, read with me on page 59. One of the first great American storytellers, Edgar Allan Poe, made the most of a short, tragic life. Orphaned at the age of 3, Poe was raised by foster parents, the Allans, from whom he took his middle name. The Allans were good to Poe and gave him an education, but he had to leave college when his foster father refused to pay Poe's gambling debts. Poe found some happiness when he married Virginia Clem. However, her early death from tuberculosis in 1847 caused Poe to become increasingly antisocial. In 1849, he was discovered in a delirious condition on a Baltimore street, and 3 days later, he was dead. An inspiration to later generations. Like few others, Poe blazed trails for future writers. His work helped to define the short story. His dark imagination helped establish the genre of horror literature, now popularized by writers like Stephen King, who has said often that it was the work of Poe that really kind of taught him how to become a writer of horror. And then under the Do You Know, Poe invented the genre of the detective story with his tale, The Murders on the Rue Morgue. The background information here, catacombs, read it with me on page 59. Much of the action in this story takes place in catacombs, underground tunnels that house tombs. These long, often complex passageways stretch out like cities of the dead. In past centuries, some wealthy European families held funerals in catacombs beneath the family manor. The dead were laid to rest, surrounded by the bones of their ancestors. By the way, just jump to 3a for a quick moment, relationship to other texts. While we haven't studied it yet as freshmen, we will study Shakespeare's classic Romeo and Juliet, and that play will end in catacombs, in a burial under the ground, okay? Let's now turn to the text itself, the Cask of Amontillado. First of all, to the title, it's very simple. It is not a difficult title, and the text itself is pretty simply horrifying, we might say. Cask simply means bottle. Amontillado is a kind of wine. So in other words, just put it in your notes, the Cask of Amontillado is simply a bottle of wine. Not just any bottle of wine, a special bottle of wine. Now we're going to have 3 things happening in this story that we want to jot down right away. 1, we're going to have a man who is mad at another man because of an injustice or a grievance. Something nasty happened to him. Number 2, in our story we're going to have payback, revenge. Write it down. This is a story of revenge. We're going to ask, and put it in your notes, this is one of the key questions, what motivates the revenge? Like why? Why is somebody upset at somebody else? Finally, number 3. This is going to be a story about death. And at the conclusion of our story, we will in fact have to recognize just how disturbing this story actually is. Now, I will just pause here and tell you that by your senior year, if we follow our high school anthology, you will have read more by a single writer than any other writer. And it's not Shakespeare, believe it or not. It actually is Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to see him in almost every year except for the senior year when we study British authors, and we'll make references to Poe during our senior experience as well. So this is a really important writer for us. Let's point out something at 2B, though, about his writing style. Many readers of Poe have noted that Poe writes with really long, complicated, drawn-out sentences. Put it in your notes this way. In the same way that in the story, two men are going to go down into the catacombs, where the events of the story will take place, twisting, turning, first left, then right, then another right, then three lefts, then another right, twisting down into the catacombs. Poe's prose has a tendency to mirror that kind of action as well. In other words, you can easily get lost in prose, in the prose of Poe. And so I'm going to recommend now that while we are following along with our reading, you want to pay particular attention as you follow along. Hesitate the temptation to just let the story be read for you. Concentrate on improving your reading by seeing if you can concentrate throughout the entire story and follow along. All right, we are on page 61 now. We turn to professional reading again. We'll follow this text all the way through to the end. And when we finish, we will then ask questions at level 1 and at level 2 and 3. All right? All right, here we go.
The Cask of Amontillado, Edgar Allan Poe.
In The Cask of Amontillado, a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, the scenario is simple. Montresor asks his friend Fortunato to sample the sherry wine he has just bought. But the pair are not really friends. Montresor believes Fortunato has insulted him and has vowed to take revenge. Read along to find out how Montresor gets even.
The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could. But when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. It must be understood that neither by word nor deed had I given Fortunato cause to doubt my goodwill. I continued, as was my wont, to smile in his face, and he did not perceive that my smile now was at the thought of his immolation. He had a weak point, this Fortunato, although in other regards he was a man to be respected and even feared. He prided himself on his connoisseurship in wine. Few Italians have the true virtuoso spirit. For the most part, their enthusiasm is adopted to suit the time, an opportunity to practice imposture upon the British and Austrian millionaires. In painting and gemmery, Fortunato, like his countrymen, was a quack. But in the matter of old wines, he was sincere. In this respect, I did not differ from him materially. I was skillful in the Italian vintages myself, and bought largely whenever I could. It was about dusk one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I thought I should never have done wringing his hand. I said to him, "My dear Fortunato, you are luckily met. How remarkably well you are looking today. But I have received a pipe of what passes for Amontillado, and I have my doubts." "How?" said he. "Amontillado? A pipe? Impossible. And in the middle of the carnival?" "I have my doubts," I replied, "and I was silly enough to pay the full Amontillado price without consulting you in the matter. You were not to be found, and I was fearful of losing a bargain." "Amontillado? I have my doubts." "Amontillado? And I must satisfy them." "Amontillado? As you are engaged, I am on my way to Lucchese. If anyone has a critical turn, it is he. He will tell me." "Lucchese cannot tell Amontillado from sherry." "And yet some fools will have it that his taste is a match for your own." "Come, let us go." "Whither? Into your vaults?" "My friend, no, I will not impose upon your good nature. I perceive you have an engagement." "Lucchese, I have no engagement. Come." "My friend, no, it is not the engagement, but the severe cold with which I perceive you are afflicted. The vaults are insufferably damp. They are encrusted with nitre." "Let us go. Nevertheless, the cold is merely nothing." "Amontillado? You have been imposed upon, and as for Lucchese, he cannot distinguish sherry from Amontillado." Thus speaking, Fortunato possessed himself of my arm. Putting on a mask of black silk and drawing a roquelaure closely about my person, I suffered him to hurry me to my palazzo. There were no attendants at home. They had absconded to make merry in honor of the time. I had told them that I should not return until the morning, and had given them explicit orders not to stir from the house. These orders were sufficient, I well knew, to ensure their immediate disappearance, one and all, as soon as my back was turned. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together on the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells upon his cap jingled as he strode. "The pipe?" said he. "It is further on," said I, "but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls." He turned toward me and looked into my eyes with 2 filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. "Nitre?" he asked at length. "Nitre," I replied. "How long have you had that cough?" My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. "It is nothing," he said at last. "Come," I said with decision, "we will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy, as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me, it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucchese." "Enough," he said. The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough." True, I replied. "And indeed I had no intention of alarming you unnecessarily, but you should use all proper caution. A draught of this Medoc will defend us from the damps." Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle that I drew from a long row of its fellows that lay upon the mold. "Drink," I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly, while his bells jingled. "I drink," he said, "to the buried that repose around us." "And I to your long life." He again took my arm, and we proceeded. "These vaults," he said, "are extensive." "The Montresors," I replied, "were a great and numerous family." I forget your arms. A huge human foot door in a field azure. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel. And the motto? Nemo me impune lecassit. Good, he said. The wine sparkled in his eyes and the bells jingled. My own fancy grew warm with the medoc. We had passed through walls of piled bones with casks and puncheons, intermingling into the inmost recesses of the catacombs. I paused again, and this time I made bold to seize Fortunato by an arm above the elbow. "The nitre," I said, "see? It increases. It hangs like moss upon the vaults. We are below the river's bed. The drops of moisture trickle among the bones. Come, we will go back ere it is too late. Your cough! It is nothing," he said. "Let us go on. But first, another draught of the medoc." I broke and reached him a flagon of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upward with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. "You do not comprehend?" he said. "Not I," I replied. "Then you are not of the Brotherhood." "How?" "You are not of the Masons." "Yes, yes," I said. "Yes, yes." "You? Impossible! A Mason?" "A Mason," I replied. "A sign?" he said. "It is this," I answered, producing a trowel from beneath the folds of my rock lore. "You jest," he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. Let us proceed to the Amontillado." "Be it so," I said, replacing the tool beneath the cloak and again offering him my arm. He leaned upon it heavily. We continued our route in search of the Amontillado. We passed through a range of low arches, descended, passed on, and descending again arrived at a deep crypt in which the foulness of the air caused our flambeaux rather to glow than flame. At the most remote end of the crypt there appeared another, less spacious. Its walls had been lined with human remains, piled to the vault overhead in the fashion of the great catacombs of Paris. 3 sides of this interior crypt were still ornamented in this manner. From the 4th, the bones had been thrown down and lay promiscuously upon the earth, forming at one point a mound of some size. Within the wall, thus exposed by the displacing of the bones, we perceived a still interior recess, in depth about 4 feet, in width 3, in height 6 or 7. It seemed to have been constructed for no especial use within itself, but formed merely the interval between 2 of the colossal supports of the roof of the catacombs, and was backed by one of their circumscribing walls of solid granite. It was in vain that Fortunato, uplifting his dull torch, endeavored to pry into the depth of the recess. Its termination the feeble light did not enable us to see. "Proceed," I said. "Herein is the Amontillado." "As for Lucchesi, he is an ignoramus," interrupted my friend as he stepped unsteadily forward, while I followed immediately at his heels. In an instant he had reached the extremity of the niche, and finding his progress arrested by the rock, stood stupidly bewildered. A moment more, and I had fettered him to the granite. In its surface were 2 iron staples distant from each other about 2 feet horizontally. From one of these depended a short chain, from the other a padlock. Throwing the links about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. "Pass your hand," I said, "over the wall. You cannot help feeling the nitre. Indeed, it is very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return. No? And then I must positively leave you. But I must first render you all the little attentions in my power. The Amontillado! Ejaculated my friend, not yet recovered from his astonishment. True, I replied, the Amontillado. As I said these words, I busied myself among the pile of bones of which I have before spoken. Throwing them aside, I soon uncovered a quantity of building stone and mortar. With these materials, and with the aid of my trowel, I began vigorously to wall up the entrance of the niche. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in a great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low, moaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. There was then a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier, and the third, and the fourth. And then I heard the furious vibrations of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which, that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction, I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel, and finished without interruption the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the mason work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated. I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier,